This is a good one. This Substack that I wrote after running the marathon holds a special place in my heart. If I remember right, Maddie and I got back to Stillwater on Sunday night, end of the weekend. Monday morning, woke up, had school, whatnot. Probably had a bunch of classwork and things like that to do because I'd been traveling so much. And I remember just saying, I don't care what I have to do. I'm going to write about this experience. And I did. I wrote what was on my heart. So without further ado, I'm going to let this one speak for itself. This is In the Arena. Let's get real. It's not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, and comes up short again and again because there is no effort without error or shortcoming, but who knows the great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who, at the worst, if he fails, at least he fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who knew neither victory nor defeat. Theodore Roosevelt. The first time I saw this quote by Theodore Roosevelt was when my friend John went asked for help memorizing it for a speech she was giving. It's a really, really difficult quote to memorize if you can't tell by the old language. So I spent a lot of time just looking at it as she recited it over and over again, piece by piece. And I thought it was a great quote at the time, but Roosevelt's words didn't really stick with me. The second time I saw the quote was in an email from Josh Taylor, director of the Hargis Leadership Institute at Oklahoma State University. Last fall, Josh generously donated his time to help me prepare for the National FFA officer interviews, and before I traveled to Indianapolis for a convention and the interviews, he sent me the Roosevelt quote as words of encouragement. After the interviews concluded, I laid in bed in my hotel room and I just thought about the quote. It kind of came back to me out of nowhere. At the time, I recognized that my work was done. The power was out of my hands. I was done interviewing. And before I turned the bedside lamp off, I opened up YouTube on my phone and went to this really cool reciting of it and just listened to it. And as they played from my phone speakers, I knew that the selection committee was working really late into the night, long after I fell asleep, to pick the next national officer team. The next day, they did not select me to be on the team. In the arena of National FFA office, I failed. In the days following the failure, I developed a really deep appreciation for the quote because it allowed me to reflect on the journey with gratitude rather than being disappointed of myself or loathing my performance. Moments of pain, or would have been pain, they turned into fond reflection, and honestly, I felt really liberated because for the first time in 2 years, I ran twice, I was free to choose a new long-term goal. I didn't have the question of if national office is a thing on my mind anymore. It was time for the next big thing, the next arena. And that's where Betsy Hartley comes in. Betsy is by far the coolest person I know. Just to paint you a picture of how cool Betsy is, one time after a long run, I was talking to her on the phone about how it went. And I knew that she'd run a lot of ultramarathons. I also knew there's not very many people in the world who do that kind of thing. So I just asked her, I was like, have you met David Goggins? And she's like, yeah, one time before we started a race together, I was joking about him about bowel movements before we started. Just said it casually. Betsy is that cool. For the first few decades of her life, she fought a really bad eating disorder and obesity, but she had an iron will to get healthy. She went on to lose over 200 pounds, fell in love with running, and eventually completed a 100-mile ultramarathon in Oregon's Cascade Mountains, which, if you're familiar, are not the prettiest territory to be running in. If you want to know her full story, check out her book. I have it linked in the Substack. It's called All Bets Are Off. You can find it on Amazon. Anywhere else that you find books, you really will not regret it. If you ever get the privilege of meeting Betsy, you're not going to forget her either. She stands out from the crowd with a really just infectious smile, this huge personality, and the perfectly timed curse words, which I wish I was as good at using them as she was. At the National FFA convention, when I ran for national office, Betsy and I talked a lot about running. I'd recently started listening to people like Nick Bear and Cam Haines, who are big in the running community, and listening to their firsthand ultramarathon stories was really fascinating. I asked Betsy about all kinds of stories about training and stuff, and I told her someday, at the time I thought would be a lot further away, I might be interested in running at least a marathon. And when I said that, her eyes just lit up with this childlike enthusiasm. So when I got back to Stillwater, things had changed a lot in my life, and the idea of running a marathon was pretty attractive because after a big failure, it was time for redemption. But this time I wanted something that I would have total control over. It wasn't going to be up to anybody else. I realized that I was going to run a marathon. The Hogeye Marathon is in Springdale, Arkansas, and it was the perfect race because two other friends and mentors from my National Officer Candidate journey, Jason and Jonelle Wetzler, lived there. So I consulted Betsy. She's like, yep, good race, go for it. And the next arena was entered. The thing about Betsy is she is a true example of a humble servant. She's going to be the last person to bring up her incredible story, but she's going to be the first person to help you begin yours. She recommended shoes. She wrote up this entire training schedule. She set me up on her favorite coaching platform, which synced all of my runs without even trying so she could look at them and give me feedback. It was incredible because if you aren't familiar with fitness coaching, it costs hundreds, if not thousands of dollars. That's why people don't typically do it unless they're professional athletes. But Betsy did it all for free. The other cool part about this whole deal is while I was learning to run, Betsy was relearning to run because last fall she went through a hip replacement procedure, and thanks to modern medicine, which is quite frankly amazing, the recovery process was so fast that she was walking on the first day after the surgery and eventually wanted to start running. For most people, if you get a hip replacement, you're like, yeah, I can walk without pain. This is great. But Betsy in a text said, I just want to run ultras in the mountains. It's a direct quote. Her excitement to be running again in the condition that she was in was like motivation rocket fuel every morning. On November 19th, she sent me a photo of the first time she got to actually run a short little distance after her hip replacement. And I think that morning I just blasted off. I had no idea how fast I was going, but I was so excited. Betsy and I continued to keep touch with each other, and we talked about our training and everything. She sent beautiful photos of her morning trail hikes and runs in the Oregon wilderness. And each time I went on a long run, I'd give her updates and whatnot. But I would more importantly tell myself, if Betsy can run in the mountains after a hip replacement surgery, I can do a new distance PR on flat ground at age 20. Her eagerness to get back in shape was so infectious. On March 16th, Betsy finished her first post-hip replacement 5K race. And a few days later, we were lucky enough to be able to meet up at the Oregon FFA State Convention. And she was still so excited. We showed pictures, talked about it, broke it down. Betsy was, and to this day, is still in the arena, and it's one of the most inspiring things I've ever seen. A few weeks after that, my training got really, really difficult. Each weekend, I went on this progressively longer run. The first long run was 9 miles long in December, and that felt difficult. The last 3 long runs were 16 miles. Listen to the last episode if you're curious. 18.7 miles and 20 miles. Each one of them left me just pretty much lying on the ground before going to the shower. On the 20-mile one, Maddie had to come pick me up, even though I was a block away, because I was I literally just can't move on my feet anymore. And after each long run, I would call Betsy and give her an update and be like, Betsy, I hurt. And she would be like, yeah, you do. And you're going to hurt even more next week, in the most exciting way ever. She was always ecstatic about my progress, and I was always inspired by hers. The thing about the training is it wasn't just physically grueling. Trust me, it hurt a lot. But it was also difficult because when you're training for a marathon, especially when you live in a fraternity house like I did at the time, you're definitely the only person training for a marathon. Going to bed early so your body can recover for the next morning run is not the normal thing to do when you live in a fraternity. I learned that when you are completely alone in your behavior, it's incredibly difficult to justify it to others. The amount of times I got asked, why are you going to bed so early? Why are you up so early? Insane. Being the first person awake in a massive house of 90 guys every day for months gets really lonely. And the thing about loneliness is to be lonely is to feel isolated from others. Hundreds of miles of training were run in solitude, where I was alone, but the loneliness set in when I was surrounded by friends who lived very different lifestyles right next to me. The arena was and is uncomfortable. In the weeks leading up to race day, it was pretty clear that despite the loneliness, I wasn't alone. 2 weeks before race day, I learned my friend Nathan Loudon was running the Bend, Oregon Marathon a week before my race. The week before race day, I facilitated a training to the newly elected Nebraska FFA State Officer team. They were not runners, but they were very curious and excited and wished me the best of luck after only knowing each other for a few days. And then in the few days leading up to the race, my friend Josiah decided that his family, while they only had a few days in the Midwest, were going to get in a van and drive with him all the way to Northwest Arkansas to cheer me on. My girlfriend Maddie, who had put up with months of my training obsession and quite frankly probably should have, just let me go after all of it, she made sure that I was eating and sleeping before the race to be prepared. And as always, Betsy and I messaged about the race every single day. When we talked on the phone 2 days before, I was pretty sure she was more excited than I was. The day before the race, Maddie and I drove to the Wetzler's house in Rogers, Arkansas. I'd spent several weeks there over the years training for national office. Their community contains these awesome, just really kind, down-to-earth people who really push each other to do hard things in CrossFit Reverence in the gym. And then when it's over, they all hang out like the best of friends and really celebrate each other's efforts. I think their community, if anything, proves that challenges build really strong relationships, because this community, it embodies this idea of like holistic health, where the physical challenges, they improve the community's health, in their bodies, but then that health improves the community's, connectedness and caring about each other, because it allows them to do more things together. The CrossFit Reverence crew was entering 3 teams into the Hogeye Marathon Relay, and I was really excited to run the course with them, even if I only got to see them for a second. I was even more excited this weekend to introduce them to Maddie, because it was her first time going to Arkansas. When we got into Arkansas, we hung out at Jason and Jonelle's for a little bit, had some good Italian food for carbs for the night before the race, and went to sleep. It was pretty simple. Betsy had mailed me a care package with a letter of encouragement, a pack of bath salts for after the race, and then a copy of the book Born to Run, which is fantastic. It felt right. Everything was in place. The race day began at 5 a.m. bright and early. I ate a piece of toast, peanut butter, honey, coffee, and some endurance fuel drink mix. At 6 a.m., we drove to the start line, took photos, and got warmed up. And I would run the first 8 miles of the race with Mitch Baker. Mitch is crazy. He's completed marathons, Ironmans, all kinds of stuff. And when, the time came, we got into place, and I wasn't nervous, but just the energy of a few hundred people waiting to do something that 0.01% of the world's population do every year was crazy. Betsy had told me about the race day energy, and I was like, yeah, it's a big event, but nothing can really prepare you for the feeling of standing in this crowd that's ready to just go nuts running. When the starting gun went off, we began to run. The first 5 miles of the race felt like just a blip in time, just snap by. After 2 weeks of focusing on recovery, because you do this thing called a taper when you train, where you train really hard and then you pretty much do very little to nothing for the last 2 weeks. After all that, my body was super fresh. Mitch told me what to do when the race got harder and avoid walking or tripping. I think his last advice, he was like, be careful when you run along curbs. Don't walk the hills because you'll regret it. And don't effing trip. That was his last thing he said before he took off. At mile 7, he ended up picking up the pace so his relay team could win in the CrossFit Reverence group. So I, found a porta potty, emptied my bladder, and just set out alone. Running in solitude was a familiar feeling, but I wasn't lonely. At mile 8.5, I rounded a corner to see the first relay exchange station. Mitch had already been there and been gone. He'd passed off the relay item to Jason, who was now speeding ahead to the next station. But the rest of the crew was gathered. They were waiting for me to come through. Maddie had made a dozen of these massive signs on construction paper with these funny, encouraging slogans and pictures. So everybody had a sign. They were yelling at the top of their lungs. And I just smiled, fist pumped, and kept on running. I was high on encouragement, and the next 3 miles flew by even faster. At mile 11, I made a friend. His name was Misael Perez, and I found him running down the slope. We were going about the same place. And you don't really know what the etiquette is. Eventually, he just reached out and said, how you doing? So we started talking. I learned that he was a high school math teacher from Clarksville, Arkansas. It was also his first marathon. He'd read that book that Betsy gave me, Born to Run, and just got this fuel in him to go run. So he signed up for the race. We talked about everything from teaching to running to our families for miles and miles and miles. Around mile 15 together, we passed the second relay exchange station where Josiah and his family had made it to the course. So now there were 15 people, this massive crowd, all waving signs as they yelled at the top of their lungs when I ran by. Misael at first, he was like, what the heck? And then he realized what it was. and couldn't help but laugh as they berated us with these words of encouragement. Things started to get really hard at mile 20. I remember thinking at mile 18, like, man, this is feeling pretty good. I might be able to lay down a pretty good time today. And then we got to mile 20. Misael and I climbed hills. We battled this headwind for what seemed like an eternity. And we noticed that like the more we ran, the more our hips and our knees, not like the muscles around them, but the joints themselves just started getting really sore from absorbing the impact of thousands and thousands of foot strikes. At this point in the marathon, this is where the thing called the wall sets in, when runners hit the wall. Basically what happens is after, hours of running, your body's low on fuel, your joints are sore, and your mind is just wandering and wandering, thinking like, why do I have to keep running? There's nothing chasing us. I'd experienced the wall during training, during several long runs, which meant that I knew how to handle it, and it wasn't going to stop me. So Misael and I pushed on for a few miles. Misael was feeling good. He thought he was going to run a sub 4-hour time, so he pushed a little faster, and I kept a steady pace. I was like, I'm in it for the long haul. I just embraced the solitude that I had experienced through 6 prior months of training. At mile 22, my body was even worse. It was just screaming at me to at least walk, if not stop. The third relay station came and went. The encouragement helped, but like at that point, they only go so far after 3.5 hours of running. At mile 23, I found Misael running slower than before. I think that push that he'd had was really hurting him. So we tried to hold a conversation, tried to, help each other out by distracting from the pain in our joints. But we quickly agreed, like, we can't talk as there's no stopping until the finish line, so we just got to keep going. At mile 24, he ended up slowing a little bit more. And at this point, like, as much as I wanted to stay with him, there was a thought in my mind, like, I think we can finish this thing together. I knew that if I slowed down and took longer to get to the finish line, it was all going to be harder, and I was probably going to stop with how much pain I was in. So I kept on powering forward. And at this point, just every piece of bone and muscle and connective tissue in my legs was just on fire. It was battling for every single step with several miles to go. At the 1 mile left point, this was like a sign in my mind, I rounded a corner and I saw an Oklahoma State pop-up tent with 3 fellow pokes like wearing these huge, like basically Oklahoma State jumpsuits. They were handing out water and Gatorade. And when I ran by, the guy holds out this tray and he goes, "Jello shot?" And I was like, I'm going to yak or do something worse if I take that right now. But I did take the seeing of this as a sign to push with everything I had for the last mile. I just yelled "Go Pokes" at the top of my lungs, threw up a pistols firing, and ran even faster. At the 26-mile mark, 0.2 miles to go, I could see the huge crowd of people that had been with me for every relay station with their signs yelling louder than ever, just short of the finish line. I probably wasn't running very fast, but I ran as fast as I possibly could towards them. And finally, after 4 hours, 8 minutes, and 24 seconds of running, I crossed the finish line. I grabbed a banana from the volunteer station and sat down on a curb, and I just thought to myself, like, man, it's over. Failure in one arena opened the door to another, and after 6 months of grueling training, a lot of loneliness, and many, many miles of solitude, I realized one thing had been constant throughout that entire experience, and that was my community. They may not have been nearby. They may have been states away. They definitely weren't on the trail with me most of the time, but they were there, and that was Maddie, Betsy, Josiah, Jason, and Jonelle. They were always in my corner. They gave me guidance, they gave me encouragement, and when the day came, they brought more and more people to cheer. They were in the arena with me, even if it was from hundreds of miles away at times. That night, we were all hanging out at the Wetzler's house. Surprisingly, I felt pretty good. Like, I got done, and I was stiff. I laid on the couch for a while, showered, and then eventually got some energy back. Jason's friend Jackson, who is a pretty talented country musician, was in town, so we sat around a fire real late into the night listening to him play and just talking. Long after the sun went down, my friend Art, who is part of the CrossFit Reverence crew, just out of nowhere, it was really funny, started this really deep conversation with Maddie and I. But towards the end of the conversation, he dropped this amazing bit of wisdom that this whole weekend just felt like a sign, but the thing that he said here felt like a sign too. He said, 30% of life is painful and difficult. The rest of it is awesome. When you get to the hard moment, know what to do so you can get back to the good stuff. And from that, I took that we must experience the pain and difficulty to get to the good stuff, because the pain and difficulty make the rest of life incredible. It's that perspective. It's a magical thing. This weekend was one of the best and one of the most painful of my life, ×2. The marathon, it was grueling. My body never experienced so much physical pain, and my mind had never had to just pull itself together to muster so much mental strength. Training had made the fighting through the pain a little bit easier, if easy is even a word you can use for something like that, but it allowed me to know what I need to do. And then when the pain stopped, the rest of the weekend was the good stuff, probably the best in my life. The thing is, though, if it weren't for the pain and difficulty, the weekend wouldn't have been the same, because the pain and difficulty came from being in the arena. Guys, listeners, life is awesome, but you have to make it awesome. It's not just going to be awesome for you. And it's all about having perspective. If you never experience any pain and difficulty, the rest of your life is going to seem real underwhelming. It may and probably will seem even more painful and difficult if you don't make yourself have some grueling things. Getting ready to handle pain and difficulty is going to put the good stuff right around the corner because you're going to know how to handle it. Being in the arena, covered in sweat and blood, falling short again and again, that's where you get ready. That is where life becomes more than you thought was possible. And communities that live in the arena together are stronger. They are the good stuff. This Substack and really just this whole writing was inspired by Betsy's journey and just the incredible person she is. I appreciate her so much for everything she did. That's also inspired by Art's stellar quote that I still can't get over. Like, there's very few things that you hear from people who are under the age of, I'm going to say 60, somewhere in there, that just blow your mind, like immense wisdom, and that was one of them. Also, The Comfort Crisis by Michael Easter. That was a lot of my motivation and inspiration to do this. And the video Good by Jocko Willink. If you haven't listened to it, it's a bit much. It's a little hardcore, but it might give you some motivation to go do something difficult. When I got ready to record this podcast, I read through it, the Substack, and I was like, man, like I got goosebumps thinking about this weekend because I can't describe to you how good it really was, despite being by far the most painful weekend of my life, like I said. And the subtitle for this Substack was something like How Running a Marathon Makes for a Better Life. And most people, when they think running, they go, ugh, it's so painful, it's hard, I can't even do it very long. The thing is, though, one, you probably haven't tried it a lot and really dedicated some time to it. That helps a lot. But two, I just think we have a bad perception of what happiness or fulfillment or just what makes a good life, right? Like, I think in America, because we have things so good, and this is a young perspective, so I may be wrong, I think we expect things to be good by default. I think we expect that if we go through our lives, we might get lucky and nothing will happen to us. But it's just not a good way to approach life because, as we talked about in the last episode, the only thing that's certain is uncertainty. Anything can happen. So if you force yourself to do something really hard, really big, put yourself through some pain that's safe, keep that in mind, I think your life's going to be a lot better. You don't have to run a marathon. You don't. I, for most people, would advise against it because it takes so much time and effort that it's probably going to subtract from other areas of your life. But there's something out there that you can do that'll make your life better by going through a challenge. So I hope you find it. I hope this episode inspired you to do something. My goal here is not to tell you why you should work to get better in your life, but rather to make you feel like you want to get better. And I hope this episode made you do that. Thanks for listening. Catch you in the next one. Let's get real.